Hi and welcome. I'm Midnight Truth, and it's so nice to have you here tonight. Wherever you are right now, whether you're in bed, lying on the couch, or just looking for a quiet moment, I want you to know this time is for you. Take a deep breath in, and as you breathe out, feel the weight of the day start to fade. Let your mind settle, let your body relax, and let yourself simply be. There's no rush, no pressure, just this calm, quiet moment. If you'd like, you can close your eyes and imagine yourself in a peaceful place. Maybe it's a cozy room with soft, warm lighting. Or maybe it's under a starry sky, with a gentle breeze brushing against you. Wherever you feel safe and calm, let yourself drift there. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Tonight's story is gentle and soothing, perfect to carry you into a deep, restful sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. I didn't think much of the house when I first saw it. It was old, sure, Victorian style with a sagging front porch and windows that seemed too dark even in daylight, but it was cheap. And after the mess of my divorce, cheap was exactly what I needed. The landlord, a thin, quiet man named Mr. Larkin, barely spoke as he handed me the keys. "It's been empty a while," he said, shifting on his feet. "Last tenant left in a hurry. Didn't say why." I brushed it off. People leave places for all sorts of reasons. Maybe they couldn't afford it. Maybe they got a job somewhere else. Maybe they just didn't like the way the walls groaned at night. That was the first thing I noticed, the sounds. The house had a voice of its own. Every step I took made the floor protest beneath me. The pipes groaned when I turned on the water. At night, the wind pushed against the windows, making them rattle like impatient hands trying to get in. The smell was another thing. Not strong, just there. A faint scent of damp wood and something older, something that reminded me of the attic in my grandmother's house, where dust coated forgotten things. Still, I told myself I was being dramatic. It was just an old house, and old houses made noises. I had more important things to worry about, like unpacking and starting over. I settled into a routine. Work during the day, frozen dinners at night, a beer or two before bed. The house felt empty but not unwelcoming. It was mine, at least for now, and that was enough. I didn't meet anyone in town for the first couple of days. The street was quiet, the kind of place where people kept to themselves. It was different from where I had lived before, back when I still shared an apartment with my ex-wife. That place had been filled with the noise of other people. Doors slamming, muffled music, the hum of city life. Here, the silence felt thick, pressing in at night when I lay in bed. Then I met Mrs. Henderson. She lived across the street in a house just as old as mine, though hers was better maintained, with flower beds lining the front. I first saw her watching me from her porch, her small frame wrapped in a thick cardigan despite the warm evening air. "You moved in fast," she said when I walked over to introduce myself. "Not many people stay there long." I raised an eyebrow. "Why's that?" She pursed her lips, glancing at my house like it might overhear her. "People say things happen in that place. Strange things. Last man who lived there, he ran out in the middle of the night. Left everything behind." I forced a chuckle. "Ghosts, huh?" She didn't laugh. "Something like that." I thanked her for the warning, but as I walked back to my house, I felt an odd sensation, like the house was watching me, waiting. That night, I heard the footsteps for the first time. Soft at first, just a whisper of movement above me. I lived alone, and I hadn't been upstairs since moving in. My heart pounded in my chest as I held my breath, listening. Then, nothing. Just the old house settling. Just my imagination. I went to bed, convincing myself I was being ridiculous. But I didn't sleep well. And the next night, the footsteps came again. Hashtag. I tried to ignore it at first. Houses creak. It's what they do. Maybe there were mice in the walls, or the wood was shifting from the temperature changes. Still, the sound stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind during the day. When I left for work, I glanced up at the windows on the second floor, half expecting to see movement behind the glass. There was never anything there, but the feeling didn't go away. The following evening, I decided to check upstairs. I hadn't bothered unpacking much yet, leaving most of my things in boxes downstairs. The second floor had 3 rooms, a master bedroom, a smaller guest room, and a study. The landlord said the last tenant had used the study as an office, but the room had been completely emptied before I moved in. The steps creaked under my weight as I climbed. I paused at the top, listening, but everything was still. The master bedroom was bare except for my bed and a nightstand. The guest room was empty. Then I opened the door to the study. The first thing that hit me was the smell, stronger than anywhere else in the house. That same damp, musty scent, but heavier. Stagnant. The floor was scuffed, the wooden planks worn down in odd, uneven patches, as if someone had paced the same spots over and over. I ran a hand along the walls, feeling the coolness of the plaster. In the farthest corner, near the baseboard, there was a dark stain. Old water damage, maybe, or something else. I left the room quickly, shutting the door behind me. That night, I slept with the lamp on. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. A week passed, and I did my best to ignore the house's quirks. The noises didn't stop, but they didn't get worse either. If I didn't acknowledge them, maybe they wouldn't mean anything. One evening, after a long day at work, I stopped at the corner store for a six-pack. The cashier, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, scanned my items without much interest. "You're the guy in the old Harding house, right?" he asked suddenly. I hesitated. "I guess so. That what it's called?" "Yeah. Used to belong to some professor or something. Old man Harding. Taught history, I think. Did weird research." "What kind of research?" The cashier shrugged. "No idea. Just what people say. He was obsessed with something. Spent all his time locked in that house, writing stuff down. No one saw him much. Then one day he just disappeared. Never found a body or nothing." I felt a chill creep up my spine. "How long ago was this?" I asked. "Years. Decades, probably." He handed me my change. "Be careful in there." I nodded, grabbing my beer and heading home. That night, the footsteps were louder. This time they didn't stop. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The sound was steady, deliberate. Not just the house settling. Someone was walking above me. My breath came shallow and quick. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it, but the rhythm of the steps was too real, too human. Gathering my nerve, I swung my legs out of bed and stood. The floor was cold beneath my feet. I moved toward the hallway, every muscle in my body tensed. My fingers brushed the banister as I looked up the stairs. The landing was dark, the doorway to the study barely visible at the end of the hall. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. I stayed there, listening, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, just as I started to turn away, the study door creaked open. A slow, deliberate sound. I didn't wait. I ran. Out of the house, into the street, past Mrs. Henderson's house without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the corner store. The cashier glanced up, startled. "You okay?" I shook my head, out of breath. He nodded knowingly. "Yeah, that happens." I stared at him. "What the hell is in that house?" He sighed, rubbing his temple. "I don't know, man. But whatever Harding was trying to find, maybe it found him first." Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. I didn't go back until the sun came up. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, but I could feel it. The air was heavier, charged. The study door was open just like I knew it would be. Something had changed, and I had a feeling it wasn't going to stop. I stood in the doorway, staring at the open study. The house was silent, but the weight in the air hadn't lifted. It pressed against me, thick and unmoving, like the hush before a storm. I took a slow step forward. The floor groaned under my weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. The study door was open just a few inches. Not wide, not enough to see inside, just enough to let the darkness spill into the hallway. I forced myself to move closer. The air inside the study was colder than the rest of the house. Not just a little chill, freezing, like stepping into an open grave. The scent of damp wood and something older, something rotten, clung to the air. I swallowed hard and flicked on the light. The bulb sputtered before settling into a weak, flickering glow. The room was empty. Everything was just as I had left it, the bare walls, the scuffed floor, the stain near the baseboard. But something felt different, like the room had been disturbed even though nothing had moved. I stepped inside, ignoring the prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The boards under my feet felt uneven. I crouched, running my fingers along the floor. One of the planks near the stain was loose. My heart pounded as I pried it up. Beneath the floor was a small dark space, and inside it something wrapped in cloth. I hesitated before reaching in. The fabric crumbled under my touch, brittle with age. I pulled it out carefully, my fingers brushing against something solid inside. A book. An old, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, the edges frayed. The pages inside were yellowed, filled with dense, hurried handwriting. I turned to the first entry, and then I heard it. A breath. Not mine. Right behind me. I spun around, my pulse hammering in my ears. The room was empty, but the air was colder now. And the door had closed. I knew I hadn't touched it. I would have heard it move, felt the shift of air as it swung shut. But now it was closed tight, sealing me in with the damp, musty cold. My breath felt too loud in the quiet. I turned back to the journal, gripping it tightly. My fingers trembled as I flipped through the pages, but my eyes kept darting to the closed door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The handwriting inside the book was tight and frantic, the ink faded but still legible. I could tell right away that whoever had written this had been in a hurry. I focused on the first page, forcing myself to read. June 3rd, 1948 I have seen it. The shadow. It moves when I am not looking, but I can feel it near me. The house is shifting. It knows I am trying to understand it. A chill crept up my spine. I turned the page. The handwriting grew messier, almost desperate. June 7th, 1948 The door will not stay open. Closes when I am not looking. It watches me. I glanced up at the study door again. Still closed. Swallowing hard, I turned another page. June 12th, 1948 It does not want me here. The house is its body, the walls its skin. I hear it at night. It walks when I sleep. The floor beneath me suddenly felt unsteady, like the wood itself was breathing. I had to get out of this room. Gripping the journal tightly, I stood and moved toward the door. I reached for the handle, half expecting it to be ice cold under my fingers. But when I touched it, it was warm. Warmer than it should have been. I twisted it. The door didn't budge. Panic flickered in my chest. I twisted the knob harder, yanking at it. Held firm. I wasn't locked in. There was no lock on the door. But something was keeping it shut. I sucked in a sharp breath, pressing my forehead against the wood. "Come on," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Don't do this." The house gave no answer. I closed my eyes, willing my heart to slow down. And then, a knock. From the other side of the door. Not loud. Not frantic. Just a slow, deliberate tap. Knock. 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 I jerked back, my breath catching in my throat. My fingers tightened around the journal like a lifeline. Who the hell was there? I forced myself to move, pressing my ear against the wood. The air on the other side of the door felt colder than the room itself, like an open freezer. Silence. I reached for the doorknob again. This time it turned easily. The door swung open. The hallway was empty. I stood frozen for a long moment, listening, waiting. The house was silent. Not even the wind rattled the windows. I stepped out of the study and pulled the door shut behind me. The house felt different now. Heavier. I clutched the journal against my chest as I moved down the stairs, feeling like something was watching me from the darkened landing. I needed to get out. Hashtag. I drove without knowing where I was going. The town was small, the streets winding through neighborhoods that looked almost identical in the dim glow of the streetlights. I didn't stop until I reached the gas station at the edge of town. The same cashier was working, the one who had warned me about Harding. He looked up as I entered, his face unreadable. "You look like hell," he said. I dropped the journal onto the counter. "What do you know about this?" His eyes flicked to the book. He hesitated. "Where'd you find that?" "In my house." "In the floorboards?" He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Harding's journal." I nodded. "Tell me what you know." The cashier glanced toward the door, then leaned in slightly. "Harding was a professor, right? Taught history at some college a couple towns over. But people say he was obsessed with more than just history. He studied the occult, old rituals, things people weren't supposed to mess with." I flipped the book open, pointing to one of the passages. He wrote about something watching him. About the house shifting. The cashier's expression darkened. "Yeah, people say he started losing it near the end. Told folks he'd opened something. A door maybe. That's when he disappeared." I felt the weight of the journal in my hands. "What happened to him?" The cashier shrugged. "No one knows. Some say he ran. Others say the house took him." A shiver ran through me. I wanted to laugh it off. I wanted to tell myself that Harding had just been paranoid, that all of this was nothing more than a bad dream. But I had heard the knock. I had felt the presence in the study. And I had the sinking feeling that whatever Harding had been afraid of, it wasn't gone. Hashtag. I returned home just before dawn. The sky was turning pale, the world caught in that quiet moment before the sun fully rose. The house loomed in the early light, its windows dark and empty. I hesitated at the front door, my hand hovering over the knob. I didn't want to go inside, but I couldn't stay out here forever. Steeling myself, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was silent. No footsteps overhead. No creaking floorboards. Just stillness. I placed the journal on the kitchen table and sat down, running my hands through my hair. What now? I couldn't ignore what was happening, not anymore. The house wasn't just old. There was something wrong with it, something Harding had been trying to understand. I had to know more. I reached for the journal again, flipping to a page near the end. July 20th, 1948 _ it watches from the corners. It moves when the lights go out. I cannot leave. I cannot leave. I cannot leave. I exhaled sharply. That's when I heard it. A soft creak from the hallway. I froze. The sound came again, slow, deliberate footsteps moving toward me. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head, my pulse hammering. Nothing was there. The hallway was empty, but the air was colder now. And the study door was open. Again. My hands clenched into fists. I couldn't keep running. If Harding had left this behind, if he had been trying to warn someone, I had to know the truth. Taking a deep breath, I stood up, and I stepped into the dark. The floor was ice cold beneath my bare feet as I stepped into the hallway. The study door stood open, its dark interior yawning like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I told myself I wouldn't go inside, not yet. I just needed to see, needed to know if something had moved, if anything had changed. The air was heavier here, thick with a stale dampness that seemed to cling to my skin. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But I didn't. I inched forward. The hallway light flickered. I stopped dead in my tracks. A shape just at the edge of my vision. A shifting, black mass, too tall and too thin, standing at the threshold of the study. It wasn't there when I looked directly at it, but in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flickering presence, waiting. My throat went dry. I tried to move, to step back, but my body wouldn't obey. Then the floor groaned. The sound didn't come from me. It came from inside the study. Something was stepping closer. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. My pulse pounded so hard I could barely hear over the rush of blood in my ears. The light above me buzzed, dimmed, and then, just like that, the study door slammed shut. The entire house seemed to shudder with the force of it. I gasped, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The air had changed again, warmer now, almost normal, like nothing had happened. But something had. Something was in there, and it knew I had seen it. ####. I barely slept that night. I kept the lights on, the journal resting on the table beside me. I didn't open it again, not yet. I wasn't sure I wanted to read more. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. By morning, I had convinced myself, again, that I was just overtired. Stress, an overactive imagination, the old house playing tricks on me. That was easier than admitting the truth. But denial only lasted until I found the footprints. I had shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing my tired eyes when I saw them. Dark smudges on the hardwood floor. Bare footprints. They trailed from the study door, leading halfway down the hallway, before stopping abruptly, as if whoever left them had simply vanished. I stared, my stomach twisting into knots. They weren't mine. I checked my own feet, my socks still clean. The prints were larger than my own, too wide, too long. And they weren't wet. They were black. Like soot. I crouched, hesitantly reaching out to touch one. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, a sharp, icy pain shot through me. I jerked my hand back, gasping. The mark remained, but now, beneath the smudges, the wood looked different. Burned, charred as if something had scorched it from the inside out. A sick realization settled in my chest. These weren't just footprints. They were impressions. Something had stood there watching. And it had left a mark. ####. I needed answers. I spent the next hour flipping through Harding's journal, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. The entries grew more erratic as they went on. July 27th, 1948 _ it follows me. The shadow. It does not walk like we do. It drags itself. I feel it behind me when I sleep. August 3rd, 1948 _ the footprints do not belong to me. The house is not empty. It is never empty. August 12th, 1948 _ the door does not hold it back anymore. I slammed the book shut. My hands were shaking. I had been telling myself I was alone in this house. I wasn't. Something had been here long before I arrived. And it wasn't leaving. ###. I needed to talk to someone who knew more. Mrs. Henderson. She had warned me. Maybe she knew more than she had let on. I threw on a jacket and crossed the street. Her house was small and neat, the flower beds in the front well tended despite the chill in the air. I knocked twice and stepped back, waiting. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. I glanced at the window. The curtains were drawn, but something felt off. The house was too still. I tried the door. It was unlocked. My stomach twisted, but I stepped inside anyway. "Mrs. Henderson?" I called. Silence. The air inside was stale, as if the house had been shut up for weeks. Dust floated in the morning light, settling over the furniture like an undisturbed blanket. But the worst part? There was no sign of Mrs. Henderson. Her coat still hung by the door. A cup of tea sat on the table, long gone cold. It was like she had just vanished. I swallowed hard. Then I saw the footprints. Black, burned impressions on the wooden floor, leading from the kitchen toward the back of the house. The same as the ones in my hallway. A chill ran through me. I wasn't the only one it had been watching. Mrs. Henderson had known something. And now she was gone. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. I stumbled out of her house, my breath coming in short gasps. I needed to leave. I needed to pack my things and get as far away from this house, this town, as possible. But when I stepped onto my porch, I froze. The front door of my house was open. I had closed it when I left. I was sure of it. The hallway inside stretched into darkness. The study door was wide open now, like an invitation, or a warning. The footprints in the hallway, they were gone. But the burn marks remained. Something had changed. Something was waiting. And I wasn't sure I'd survive long enough to understand what it wanted. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. I clenched my fist. I could run. I could get in my car and leave right now and never look back. But that wouldn't change anything. Harding had tried to run. Mrs. Henderson had tried to warn me. Neither of them had escaped. I had one choice left. I had to face whatever was inside that house. Whatever Harding had unleashed. It wasn't done with me yet. And this time I wouldn't run. I stood at the edge of my porch, staring at the open front door. The house waited. The study door was wide open, dark as a wound in the dim light. My stomach churned, my instincts screaming at me to turn and run. But I knew better. If I left now, it would follow me. Just like it had followed Harding. Just like it had followed Mrs. Henderson. I took a slow breath and stepped inside. The air was wrong. Thicker than before, humid with the scent of damp wood and something deeper, something spoiled. The house seemed darker than it should have been. Even the daylight filtering through the windows couldn't reach the corners. I shut the door behind me, and then I heard it. A whisper. Oh, almost amused. I whipped around. The hallway was empty, but the voice hadn't been in the distance. It had been close. Too close. Like someone had whispered right into my ear. I clenched my fist. My breath came fast and shallow. The journal still sat on the kitchen table where I'd left it, its pages fluttering slightly as if disturbed by a breath of air. But there was no breeze. A sound drifted from the study. A slow, deliberate creak, like someone shifting their weight on the old floorboards. I swallowed hard. It was waiting. I forced my feet to move, each step a battle against the icy dread climbing my spine. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, the air growing colder with every step. The study loomed ahead. The door was wider now, open just enough to reveal the darkened interior. I stepped inside. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The room was empty, but it didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. The air was heavy, pressing in on me from all sides. The stain near the baseboard had darkened, spreading outward like an ink spill. The smell of burning wood curled in the air. And then, the floor shifted. I jerked my head down. The floorboards beneath my feet looked warped, swollen like something beneath them was pressing upward. A memory flickered. Harding's journal. _ the house is not empty. It is never empty. _ The wood let out a slow groan, stretching, creaking. And then something knocked beneath my feet. A hollow, muffled tap. Knock. 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 The same pattern I had heard before. The sound came again, harder this time, rattling the loose floorboards near the stain. I staggered backward. And then, the whisper. Closer now. Right behind me. I spun, heart slamming against my ribs. The study door slammed shut. The room plunged into darkness. I couldn't breathe. I reached for the door, fumbling blindly, but my fingers met nothing but freezing air. A shift in the dark. A shape moving just beyond my vision. I wasn't alone. The whisper came again, curling around me like smoke. Not words. Laughter. Low and broken, like something mimicking human sounds but not quite understanding them. Something cold brushed against my arm. I choked back a scream. My hands clawed at the door, the handle slipping under my grasp as the laughter grew, filling the space, swelling. And then, suddenly, silence. The air shifted. The door swung open, spilling light into the room. I stumbled out, gasping, collapsing against the hallway wall. The house was quiet again, but something had changed. I could feel it. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was playing. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the journal, Harding's frantic words blurring together in my exhausted mind. Underscore, the door does not hold it back anymore. Underscore. Underscore, does not walk like we do. Underscore. Underscore, waits. Underscore. I knew I couldn't stay here. But leaving wouldn't fix this. Mrs. Henderson had tried to warn me. Now she was gone. Harding had tried to understand. Now he was gone. And I was next. Unless I figured out what it wanted. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. By morning I had made my decision. I wasn't running. Not yet. I needed more information. And I knew exactly where to start. Harding's past. His work. Whatever he had been studying when the house took him. There had to be records. Someone in this town had to know. Because this wasn't just a haunting. It was something else. Something worse. And it wasn't finished with me yet. I left the house at dawn. The air was crisp, the early morning silence pressing against my ears like cotton. My car sat in the driveway, coated in a thin layer of frost. I scraped the windshield with numb fingers, trying to focus on the mundane act, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. It didn't work. Even out here, I felt it. I wasn't sure if it was the house itself or something inside it, but I knew it was aware of me now, and it was waiting. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. I had a plan, or at least the beginnings of one. I needed to learn more about Harding, who he was, what he had been researching before he vanished. The best place to start was the town archives. If anyone had kept records of Harding's work, it would be there. And if no one had, then maybe that was my answer too. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The town hall was old, a squat brick building with weathered columns and a perpetually flickering overhead light. The inside smelled like dust and aged paper. A bored-looking clerk sat behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. He barely glanced up when I approached. I need access to old town records, I said. Specifically anything on a man named Theodore Harding. The clerk sighed like I had personally ruined his morning. Depends on how old, he said. You looking for property records? Birth certificates? No. I need research records. Anything related to his work that got his attention. He gave me a strange look, eyes narrowing slightly. Theodore Harding? He repeated like he was tasting the name. That's not one I've heard in a long time. That sent a chill down my spine. You know him? I asked. The clerk shook his head. Not personally. But folks around here used to talk about him. He leaned forward slightly. You the one living in that house now? I hesitated. Yeah, I admitted. He nodded like that made perfect sense. You won't find much on him in the records, he said. Not officially anyway. I frowned. Why not? The clerk lowered his voice. Because a lot of it was removed. I stiffened. By who? He shrugged. Some say the university where he worked. Some say the government. He smirked a little, but there was something uneasy in his expression. And some say the house took care of it. My mouth went dry. What does that mean? The clerk gave me a long look. Then he stood up, motioning for me to follow. Come on, he said. I'll show you what we do have. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The archive room was cold. Rows of metal filing cabinets stretched along the walls, their labels yellowed with age. The clerk led me to the back of the room, stopping in front of a cabinet marked missing persons. He pulled open the drawer. Inside there were folders. Not many, but enough. He flipped through them, then plucked one from the stack. Harding, Theodore. He handed it to me. That's about all that's left, he said. Most of the original records are gone. But this one stayed. I opened the file. Inside was a single page. A missing persons report, dated September 1948. The details were sparse. Theodore Harding, last seen at his residence on August 14, 1948. No signs of forced entry. No signs of struggle. House was found empty. The final note made my skin crawl. No personal belongings recovered. House undisturbed, except for extensive burn marks on the floor ***. The same marks I had seen. The same marks that had appeared in my hallway. I swallowed hard. There was a faded photograph clipped to the file. A man in his 40s, thin, sharp-featured, with hollow eyes and a distracted expression. He looked exhausted, like he had seen something he couldn't unsee. I turned to the clerk. Do you know what happened to him? He exhaled slowly. No one does, he admitted. People say he went mad. That he was doing things in that house. Things he shouldn't have been. Occult research? I guessed. The clerk hesitated. That's one way to put it. Something about his tone made my skin prickle. What's the other way? I asked. He met my gaze. They say he wasn't researching it, he said quietly. They say he was part of it. My breath caught. What do you mean? The clerk's eyes flicked toward the door as if making sure we were alone. There used to be a name for it, he murmured. For whatever he was trying to summon. I leaned in. What name? The clerk opened his mouth, and then the lights flickered. A sharp electric buzz filled the air. The room went ice cold. The clerk froze. His expression changed, going slack blank. I took a step back. Hey, I said, voice unsteady. You okay? The clerk blinked. For a moment his eyes looked wrong, like something else was behind them. Then he shook his head like clearing a fog. What were we talking about? He asked. I stared. You were telling me about Harding's research, I said slowly. You were about to say a name. The clerk frowned. I don't remember. He rubbed his temple. Sorry, man. Must have lost my train of thought. A sinking feeling twisted in my gut. Something had stopped him. Something had taken that name away from him the moment he tried to speak it. I swallowed hard. I needed to go. Hashtag. I thanked the clerk and left the archives, clutching the folder tightly. The cold air outside hit me like a slap. I climbed into my car and sat there for a long moment, my mind racing. Harding had vanished. His research had been erased. And now, the one person who might have been able to tell me the truth had forgotten. I glanced back at the town hall. Had it taken something from him? Would it try to take something from me? The idea made my skin crawl. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. I needed to be careful. I had asked too many questions, and something was listening. Something that didn't want to be remembered. I drove home with the folder in the passenger seat, resisting the urge to glance at it every few seconds. The name. Something had taken it the moment the clerk tried to say it. Erased it from his mind like it had never existed. And if it could do that, what else could it take? The thought lodged itself in my brain, festering like a splinter. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. I needed to be careful. The house was waiting for me when I pulled into the driveway, standing silent against the gray afternoon sky. The windows stared back, dark and empty. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal. I didn't want to go inside, but I didn't have a choice. Hashtag. The air was thick when I stepped inside. Not just musty or stale, thick, like something unseen was pressing against my skin, wrapping around me the moment I crossed the threshold. I locked the door behind me, my fingers clumsy. Something was off. The house was too still, too expectant. I took a slow breath and walked to the kitchen, dropping the folder onto the table. The journal was still there, right where I'd left it. Harding's words, his warnings. I flipped open the folder, scanning the missing persons report again, my pulse drumming in my ears. Then, at the bottom of the page, I noticed something I'd missed before. A note, written in a different hand. He knew the name. That's why it took him. A chill ran through me. I sat back, my mind racing. Had Harding spoken the name aloud? Had that been his mistake? A sudden sound broke the silence. A click. Soft, deliberate. I turned my head slowly. The study door was open again. No, not just open. Waiting. I stood up, my pulse hammering in my throat. I should leave. I should walk out the door and never come back. But I knew that wouldn't work, because it was already inside me. I could feel it now, crawling along the edges of my mind. A whisper too faint to hear. I stepped forward, my body moving before my brain could catch up. The study stretched before me, dark and endless. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. Hashtag. The darkness was absolute. I reached out, my fingers grazing the rough wood of the desk. The air was thick with the scent of burnt wood. And then, a breath. Not mine. Too close. Right next to my ear. A voice just on the edge of understanding. Murmuring. Whispering. The name. I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. It didn't help. The whisper slithered into my skull, curling into my thoughts, filling the cracks with something cold and ancient. The walls groaned. The floor shifted beneath my feet. And then, a single, icy finger pressed against the back of my neck. I bolted. My hands scrabbled for the door, fumbling with the handle, the wood ice cold beneath my fingers. The whispering grew louder. I yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. The house was silent again, but something had changed. I could feel it, like the walls were pressing closer, like the house was breathing. I turned, staring at the study. The door was still open. A darkness sat inside, heavy, watching. I swallowed hard and stepped back. Whatever was in this house, whatever had taken Harding, it knew that I had heard the name, even if I didn't remember it yet. But I would, and when I did, I wasn't sure I'd be able to forget. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folder, Harding's faded photograph staring back at me. His hollow eyes seemed to hold some terrible knowledge, something I was only beginning to understand. I could still hear the whisper. Not the words, not exactly, but the rhythm of it, the way it curled around my thoughts, slithering through my skull like a song I couldn't shake. The name. It was still there, buried in my mind like something waiting to surface. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the moment I remembered it, the house would know. The whisper had already started to change. I could hear it now, even outside the study. Soft, almost teasing, drifting through the walls, brushing against the edges of my mind when I wasn't paying attention. I didn't want to sleep, but my body had other plans. At some point, exhaustion won. ####. I woke to silence. Not just the absence of noise. A silence so thick, so absolute, that it felt like the world had been smothered. The house was holding its breath. I sat up, disoriented. The kitchen was still dim, the sky outside an early morning gray. My mouth was dry, my limbs stiff. Something was different. I listened, barely breathing. No wind. No creaking floors. No distant hum of a car passing outside. I stood slowly, every muscle tense. The whisper was gone. And somehow that was worse. I stepped into the hallway. The air was thick, pressing against my skin. My ears rang in the silence. Then I noticed the floor. The stain by the study door had grown. No, not just grown, changed. It wasn't a burn mark anymore. It was a hole. A perfectly round, black hole in the wood about the size of a fist. I swallowed hard, my pulse a slow, heavy drum in my ears. I took a step closer. The edges of the hole weren't rough or splintered. They were smooth, unnaturally so, as if the wood had been melted away rather than broken. I crouched down. The hole was deep. Too deep. I couldn't see the bottom. A part of me screamed to get up, to back away, to leave it alone. But another part, the part that had read Harding's journal, that had stood in the archives and felt something take a name from the air, that part needed to know. I reached out. My fingers hovered just above the hole, inches from the darkness. The silence pressed closer, thick and expectant. And then deep below, a sound, faint, almost distant, like something shifting, something moving, something breathing. I yanked my hand back. The sound stopped. The silence returned. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could only stare at the hole, at the way it sat so impossibly dark, so impossibly wrong in the wood. I knew, without fully understanding how, that this hadn't been here before. Not even last night. The house had changed again, and I was still inside it. I forced myself to stand. I needed to go. No. ####. I packed a bag. I didn't care about the house anymore. I didn't care about Harding or the whispers or the missing records. I just needed to leave. I slung the bag over my shoulder, grabbed my keys and walked to the front door. I reached for the handle and stopped. The house was silent. Utterly, impossibly silent. Like it was waiting. A cold wave of dread crawled up my spine. I turned the handle. The door wouldn't open. I twisted harder, panic setting in. It didn't budge. I yanked, using all my strength. Nothing. The lock was undone. The deadbolt wasn't engaged. There was no reason it shouldn't open. And yet, it wouldn't. The air around me felt heavy, the walls pressing closer. I backed away, my heart hammering. I turned to the nearest window, reaching for the latch. The glass rippled, like water. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. It was keeping me here. Not just inside the house. Inside it. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to move. The hallway stretched ahead of me, impossibly long. The walls felt wrong, too close, shifting like they weren't solid anymore. The whisper returned. Low and slow, threading through the silence, curling against my skin like breath. I slammed into the study door, forcing myself inside, barely noticing when it slammed shut behind me. The whisper didn't stop. It was inside the room with me. I pressed my back against the wall, my pulse thundering. The air grew colder. A shadow pooled in the far corner. Not a trick of the light. Not my imagination. Something else moved. A slow, crawling motion, stretching upward, shifting in a way my mind couldn't fully process. The whisper grew louder. A single word, repeated over and over, pressing against my skull. The name. I understood now. I had known it all along. I opened my mouth. I don't know if I meant to say it or to scream, but before I could make a sound, the shadow lunged. The world went black. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. I woke up in the hallway. The house was quiet. The whisper was gone. I sat up slowly, my body aching. My head throbbed, my thoughts sluggish. For a moment, I couldn't remember how I'd gotten here. Then it hit me. The shadow. The whisper. The name. I reached for it, grasping at the edges of my memory. It wasn't there. I tried harder. Nothing. It was gone. Like something had reached inside my mind and carved it out. I stared at the study door. It was closed now. The hole in the floor was gone. No sign that it had ever been there. I pushed myself up, my legs shaking. I walked to the front door. I turned the handle. It opened. The cold morning air hit my face. I stepped outside, feeling the weight lift from my chest. I could leave. But as I stood there, staring at the empty street, I realized something. The whisper was gone. But the silence wasn't. The house was still waiting. And I knew deep in my bones that it wouldn't have to wait long. Because someday someone else would move in. And the name would return. Whether they wanted it to or not. I didn't go back inside right away. For a long time, I stood on the porch, breathing in the cold morning air, trying to convince myself that I was free. That I could just get in my car and drive away. But I wasn't free. I could feel it. Something inside the house had let me go. But not completely. I still belonged to it. Or maybe it still belonged to me. I clenched my fist, swallowing down the panic rising in my throat. I needed to be sure. I needed to see. I turned back to the door. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The house was quiet when I stepped inside. Not the heavy, suffocating silence from before. Something else. Something expectant. I walked carefully, my ears straining for any sound, any hint that the whisper might return. But there was nothing. I forced myself down the hallway, past the study. The door was still closed. No hole in the floor. No shadow waiting in the corner. Everything was normal. Too normal. I made my way to the bathroom. My hands were still shaking. I needed to see myself, to be sure that I was still me. The light flickered when I switched it on. I stepped in front of the mirror. At first I looked the same. Pale, tired, dark circles under my eyes. But the longer I stared, the more something felt off. The room was cold. Too cold. I exhaled. My breath fogged in the air. The mirror didn't fog. My reflection didn't fog. A chill spread through my chest, my pulse slowing. I lifted my hand. So did the reflection. I turned my head. So did it. I took a step forward. It did not. I stopped breathing. My reflection was still, watching me. My heart pounded, my body screaming at me to move, to run, to get out. But I couldn't. I could only stare. The reflection tilted its head. Not like me. Not a delayed reaction. A choice. A slow, deliberate movement. And then, without opening its mouth, it whispered, not out loud, inside my head, the name. I don't know if I screamed. The light flickered again, and my reflection was normal, moving with me, mimicking my actions, like nothing had happened, like nothing had changed. But I knew better. Something had changed, because I could still hear the whisper. Not in the house, not in the study, not even behind the mirror. It was inside me, and now it would never leave. I stopped looking in mirrors after that. It didn't help. Every reflective surface in the house felt wrong now. The glass on picture frames, the dark screen of the television, even the kitchen window at night. I avoided them as best I could, but sometimes, when I let my guard down, I would catch a glimpse of something that wasn't quite right. A movement that didn't belong to me. A shadow where there shouldn't be one. And always the whisper. It no longer came from the walls, the study, or the dark corners of the house. Now it was inside my head. Soft at first. A murmur beneath my thoughts. Then as the days passed, it grew clearer. More insistent. I had stopped trying to leave. The first time, the door hadn't opened. The second time, it had, but the world outside had seemed strange, hollow, like something had drained the color from the sky, the life from the air. I had stood in the doorway, my keys in hand, staring at the motionless trees, the still, empty street, and I had known. I wasn't meant to leave. Not yet. Not until the house was finished with me. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. It was the third night without sleep when I heard it, a sound that sent ice through my veins. A door creaking open. Not the front door. Not the bedroom door. The study. I knew, even before I stepped into the hallway, that it would be open, that it would be waiting. But I went anyway, because I had no choice. The air grew thick as I approached, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned, the house breathing around me. The study door was wide open. And the whisper, no longer a murmur, asterisk asterisk called my name asterisk asterisk. I should have turned back. I should have run. But instead I stepped inside. The room was different now. No dust. No forgotten furniture. No traces of the man who had lived here before me. Only darkness. And something waiting inside it. I could feel it before I saw it. A shape, barely visible, shifting in the farthest corner of the room. Watching. Waiting. And then moved. A slow, deliberate motion. Unfolding from the shadows, stretching too tall, too thin, its form twisting in a way that made my stomach turn. It was not human, but it had once been. I knew that with absolute certainty. And when it spoke, when it whispered in a voice that was somehow both mine and not mine, I understood. I had never been alone in this house. Not since the first night. Not since I had stepped inside and shut the door behind me. And now I never would be, because the house had already taken me. And it was only a matter of time before it took everything else. I didn't leave the study. Not right away. The figure in the corner, asterisk asterisk my asterisk asterisk shape, but not me, didn't move closer. It didn't have to. It was already inside me. I could feel it shifting beneath my skin, curling behind my ribs like something growing, something waiting. I should have run. I should have screamed. But I only stood there, staring at the shape that shouldn't exist. And then, the whisper stopped. For the first time in weeks, my mind was my own again. The absence of the sound was worse. Like the moment between heartbeats when you wonder if the next one will come. Then the figure did something I wasn't prepared for. It turned. Not towards me. Towards the desk. Where the journal sat. Harding's words. His warnings. His slow descent into the same thing that was happening to me. The shape, asterisk asterisk my shape asterisk asterisk, reached out. A hand, too long, too thin, fingers curling as they dragged across the journal's cover. Something about that movement woke me up. I took a step forward, reaching before I could stop myself. And the moment my fingers touched the book, everything went black. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. I was somewhere else. Not the study. Not the house. Somewhere in between. A place of shifting shadows, of murmuring voices, of whispers that weren't words but memories. I saw things. The past, the present, things that might have been, things that never could be. Harding standing in this very house, staring into a mirror, his reflection staring back with a different expression. A woman before him, sitting at the kitchen table, hands trembling as she wrote something down. And before her, a man pacing the hallways, whispering to himself, gripping his own arms like he was trying to hold something inside. The first, the one who had built this place. I didn't see his face, but I saw the books, the symbols carved into the floor, the door that was never meant to be opened. But he had opened it, and now no one could close it again. A voice cut through the visions. Oh, hello, you know the name now. I gasped, my body jerking like I had fallen from a great height. I was back in the study. The journal was open in my hands. I had written something inside it. I didn't remember doing it, but the ink was fresh. The words were mine. A single name. The name I had been trying so hard not to remember. I stared at it, my hands shaking. The whisper returned. Not from the house. Not from the figure in the corner. From me. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, before I could say it, the figure lunged. The world twisted. And everything, asterisk asterisk everything asterisk asterisk, went dark. When I woke, I wasn't in the study anymore. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. The room was too dark, too quiet. The air was thick, pressing against my skin like a weight. I tried to sit up, but my body was sluggish, unresponsive, like I had been asleep for years. Then I saw the journal. It was still in my hands, the ink smudged where my fingers had pressed too hard against the page. The name was still there. A name I couldn't remember writing. A name I shouldn't have written. It wasn't just ink on paper. It was something alive. The letters seemed to shift as I looked at them, stretching and curling like something trapped beneath the surface, something trying to push through. A whisper filled the room. Not in my head this time. Not from the walls. From the journal. I felt the weight of it, the awful gravity of what I had done. I had named it. I had called it. And now it was coming. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The house had changed again. I knew the moment I stepped into the hallway. The air was colder, the walls darker, like the light had been drained from them. The floor groaned beneath my feet, the sound stretching too long, too deep. Everything felt wrong. Like I had stepped into a place that only looked like my house. I forced myself forward. The hallway stretched ahead, impossibly long, the doors shifting as I passed them, as if the house itself was breathing, shifting, watching. I wasn't alone. I could feel it now, pressing against the edges of my mind. The thing I had named. It was here. Waiting. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The whisper grew louder as I reached the living room. The air rippled, like something was trying to push through. I didn't want to turn around. I knew what would be there. But I did. And I saw myself. Not a reflection. Not a shadow. Something worse. It stood in the doorway, tall and thin, its limbs stretching too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face was mine, but wrong. The eyes too deep, too dark, filled with something vast and hungry. The mouth was moving, not speaking, mouthing the name, over and over. My knees locked, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I took a step forward. The air around it twisted, the floor warping beneath its weight. It wasn't human. It had never been human. And now it had my face. The journal in my hands burned. I didn't think. I tore the page out. The moment the paper ripped, the whisper turned into a scream. The thing that wore my face lurched forward, and the world collapsed. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. I woke on the floor. The house was silent. The journal was gone. I didn't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to breathe. Then, slowly, I pushed myself up. The house looked the same. But I knew better now. It wasn't over. It would never be over. Because I had called it. And something like that doesn't just leave. Even if you stop hearing it, even if you stop seeing it, it waits. And someday someone else will move in. And the whisper will start again. Because the house never forgets. And neither does the thing that answered. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag chapter 12. What stays behind? I should have left that night. I should have walked out the front door and never looked back. But I didn't. Because the house had taken something from me. And I wasn't sure if I could leave without it. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The house felt empty. Not quiet. Not still. Just empty. Like something had been ripped out of it. Or maybe ripped out of me. I wandered through the rooms, my steps slow, careful. The air was stale, thick with something I couldn't quite name. The journal was gone. The pages I had written, gone. The name, gone. Like it had never existed. Like none of it had ever existed. But I knew better. I felt it. In the way the walls seemed to pulse beneath my fingertips. In the way the mirrors showed glimpses of something that wasn't quite me. In the way the whisper was gone, asterisk, asterisk, but not forgotten, asterisk, asterisk. The house had changed me. And I didn't think it would ever let me go. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. I found myself standing in the study. The floor was solid beneath me now. No hole. No rot. No darkness waiting beneath. The desk was still there. Empty. But I could see it. Asterisk, asterisk, the journal, the ink, the words I had written, asterisk, asterisk. I could feel the weight of them. Like they still existed somewhere just beyond my reach. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look away. But as I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the window. And it didn't turn with me. I went cold. Slowly I looked back. My reflection stood there, staring. Not moving. Not breathing. Then it smiled. A slow, unnatural curl of the lips. A smile I had never made. The whisper returned. Not from the walls. Not from the house. From inside my own head. Soft. Patient. Waiting. I backed away, my pulse hammering. The reflection stayed where it was. Watching. Smiling. Until the light flickered. And it was gone. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. I left that night. I don't remember packing. I don't remember locking the door behind me. I just remember running. And when I finally stopped, when I finally let myself breathe, I realized something. I had left the house, but I had not escaped it, because the whisper was still there, waiting, watching, and now it had my name. And one day it would call me back, because some houses never let go, and some things never leave, even when you do. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. Story 2. I never wanted to move here. But when life decides to throw everything at you at once, divorce, job loss, the kind of loneliness that settles into your bones, you take what you can get. So when I found a rental listing for a 3-bedroom house on Blackwood Lane for an absurdly low price, I barely hesitated. The place was old, the kind of house with warped wooden floors and a sloping roof that made it look like it was leaning forward, watching you. The realtor gave me the usual speech: historic charm, original fixtures, lots of character, which is code for a little rundown but still standing. I didn't care. It was cheap and I needed a fresh start. The first time I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of something stale, like old books and dust. The floor groaned under my weight as I walked through, checking the rooms. There were odd little things about the place. Light switches in strange places, doors that didn't quite close right, a single red stain on the floor near the back of the hallway that looked like someone had tried to scrub it out but never quite succeeded. It's just the wood aging, the realtor assured me when I asked about the noises. Houses settle, especially ones this old. That first night, after I finished unpacking the essentials, I stood in the kitchen, drinking a beer and staring out the small window above the sink. The backyard was overgrown, the grass tall and unkempt, pushing up against an old iron fence. Beyond that, nothing but a dense line of trees. The wind rattled the window pane, and somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. I told myself it was just the house settling. The next morning, I met my neighbor, Mrs. Hawthorne. She was in her 60s, her gray hair pulled back into a tight bun, wearing a thick cardigan despite the summer heat. She was the kind of person who talked too fast and too much, her words tumbling over each other. "You moved into that house?" she asked, her gaze lingering on the windows like she expected to see someone looking back. "Brave?" I frowned. "Brave?" She waved a hand. "Oh, people talk. It's an old house. Old houses have stories." I pressed her for more, but she only smiled, eyes distant. "Just keep an ear out at night," she said before heading back inside. That night I did, and I heard things. At first it was subtle, a faint creaking like someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. Then a quiet tapping sound, rhythmic, coming from somewhere in the walls. I turned off the TV and sat in silence, straining to hear. It stopped. I exhaled, shaking my head. "Just the house," I muttered. "Just the damn house." I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I woke up sometime around 3 a.m., the room ice cold, my breath visible in the dark. And then, from the hallway outside my bedroom door, I heard footsteps. Heavy, slow, coming closer. I held my breath, every muscle in my body frozen. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. Silence. I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking, and turned on the flashlight. The glow illuminated the door frame. Nothing there. I got up, heart hammering, and swung the door open. The hallway was empty. I stood there for a long time, listening, waiting. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a dream. I went back to bed. But I didn't sleep. Morning came, but it did nothing to chase away the unease that had settled into my bones. I went about my day pretending I had slept fine, pretending I hadn't spent the night staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of footsteps to return. By noon, I had almost convinced myself it was a dream. Almost. I decided to keep busy. I unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, made the house feel like mine. But there were quirks. The light in the hallway flickered at random. The kitchen faucet dripped, even when I turned it off tight. And no matter how many windows I opened, that faint, musty smell, like damp wood and something deeper, something sour, lingered in the air. Around midday, I stepped out onto the porch for some fresh air and spotted Mrs. Hawthorne in her front yard, pruning a patch of roses. I hesitated before calling out. "Hey, Mrs. Hawthorne." She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Settling in?" I nodded. "Yeah. Place has a few oddities." She snipped a dead rose and dusted her hands off on her cardigan. "That house has always been strange," she said, her tone light but her expression careful. I walked over to the fence separating our yards. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "People don't tend to stay there long." I frowned. "Why not?" Another pause. Then quietly, "Things happen." The way she said it sent a chill through me. I forced a laugh. "Yeah. Like what?" She met my eyes. "The last tenant ran out in the middle of the night. Left everything behind. Clothes, furniture, food in the fridge. Never came back." A cold knot twisted in my stomach. "What happened to them?" Mrs. Hawthorne shook her head. "No one knows. Never even came back for their deposit." She gave me a small, tight smile. "But I'm sure you'll be just fine." I tried to ask more, but she changed the subject, talking about the weather, the neighborhood, anything but the house. Eventually, I excused myself and went back inside. As soon as I shut the door, the air felt heavier. I wasn't alone here. I spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the way the house felt different now, how the silence pressed against my ears. The floorboards creaked when I wasn't walking. The faint tapping in the walls returned just for a moment. I ignored it. By nightfall, I was exhausted. I went to bed early, telling myself I would sleep through the night this time. I was wrong. I woke up at exactly 3:12 a.m. The room was freezing again, colder than before. My breath clouded in front of me. And then the footsteps. Not from the hallway this time. From inside my room. A slow, deliberate step near the foot of my bed. Another, closer. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The darkness felt too thick, too full. And then I felt it. A weight on the mattress. Something unseen sitting at the foot of my bed. The air was heavy, pressing down on my chest. My hands clenched the sheets. I reached out in the dark, shaking, searching for my phone. And then the weight lifted. A slow creak of floorboards. Footsteps moving away. The door to my bedroom opening. Silence. I turned on the light, heart hammering so hard it hurt. The room was empty. The door was open. I didn't sleep after that. But I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I didn't leave my bedroom until the sun had fully risen. Even then, I moved slowly, carefully, like something might still be lurking in the shadows. The house felt different in the daylight. Less menacing, almost normal. Almost. I checked every inch of the place, looking for anything that could explain what had happened the night before. A draft, a loose floorboard, some logical reason for why it had felt like someone sat on my bed in the dark. But I found nothing. The feeling lingered though. Like a scent you can't quite place, something just beneath the surface. I tried to shake it off. I went to the kitchen, made coffee, and scrolled through my phone, pretending that last night was just my imagination. Then I heard it. A faint scratching sound. At first, I thought it was just the pipes settling, but as I stood there, holding my coffee halfway to my lips, I realized, no, this was different. This was inside the walls. I pressed my ear to the kitchen wall. The sound was soft but constant. A scratching, a light scuttling, like fingernails dragging against the wood. Mice. Maybe rats? That would explain the tapping noises at night. I exhaled, relieved to have something normal to blame. I grabbed my keys, deciding to head to the store for traps and whatever else I'd need to deal with a pest problem. But before I could leave, I noticed something odd. The basement door was open. I knew I had closed it. I stared at the dark gap leading down into the basement, my skin crawling. The air that drifted up from below smelled damp and stale. Something about that open door made my stomach twist. I walked over, gripping the doorknob. The stairs leading down were shrouded in darkness. I couldn't see the bottom. The scratching sound was louder now, coming from below. I stood there, heart pounding. The logical part of my brain told me it was just pests. Nothing supernatural. Nothing to be afraid of. But I was afraid. I swallowed hard and forced myself to step forward, one foot on the first creaky step. Then another. The air grew colder the deeper I went. At the bottom, I reached for the chain hanging from the ceiling and pulled. A single dim bulb flickered to life, casting weak, yellow light across the basement. The space was cluttered with old furniture, stacks of newspapers, and forgotten belongings from whoever had lived here before. Dust hung thick in the air. But the scratching had stopped. I moved further in, checking the corners, the walls, looking for any sign of rats. That's when I saw it. A section of the wall, bricks, unlike the wooden walls of the rest of the basement. And in the center of that brick wall, something had been carved into the stone. Words. Let me out. The letters were uneven, scratched deep into the brick as though someone had clawed at it with bare hands. A chill ran through me. That's when the light went out. Pitch black. Then footsteps. Not mine. A soft whisper just behind me. Help me. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, slammed the basement door shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I called Mrs. Hawthorne. She picked up after a few rings. Hello? I swallowed hard, my voice unsteady. Did the last tenant ever say why they left? A long silence. Then in a quiet voice she said, they said something was living in the walls. I didn't go back into the basement. I couldn't. Not after what I'd seen. Not after hearing that whisper right behind me in the dark. I sat in the living room, gripping my coffee like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. Mrs. Hawthorne's words kept circling in my head. Asterisk, they said something was living in the walls. Asterisk, I told myself I misheard the whisper. That the carving on the basement wall was some cruel joke left behind by a previous tenant. That the noises in the walls were just pests. But as the day stretched on, the house felt heavier, like it was watching me. I tried to keep myself busy. I ran errands, stayed out as long as I could. But eventually I had to come back. And as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. A shift. The air was thick, pressing down on me like a weight on my chest. Then came the smell. Rotten. damp, like something deep underground, festering. I gagged, covering my nose. It wasn't coming from the kitchen or the bathroom. It was seeping from the walls. I checked every vent, every corner. Nothing. But the smell grew stronger. And then the scratching started again. Faint, slow dragging. It came from inside the walls, right next to me. I pressed my ear against the wallpaper. Something moved on the other side. Not skittering like rats. Not the random settling of an old house. Something large. Something breathing. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something I could explain away. I grabbed my keys and rushed outside, gasping in the cool evening air. Mrs. Hawthorne was on her porch, watching me. "You look pale, dear," she said, her voice careful. I walked over, still shaken. "I think something is in the walls," I admitted. "Something big." She was silent for a moment, then sighed. "I hoped it wouldn't start this soon." I blinked. "What do you mean?" She looked past me toward my house, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Years ago," she said, "before the house was a rental, a man named Edgar Whitmore lived there. He was a scholar, obsessed with the occult. People said he was trying to open a door to something he shouldn't have." A shiver ran down my spine. "They found him in the basement one morning," she continued, "dead. But the strange thing was..." She hesitated. I swallowed. "What?" She lowered her voice. "His nails were torn to the bone, like he had been clawing at the walls." My stomach dropped. I thought of the basement, the bricks, the words. Asterisk, "Let me out." Asterisk. I felt sick. "You think he trapped something inside?" Mrs. Hawthorne looked at me, her expression unreadable. "Or maybe he was trying to keep something from getting out." A gust of wind rattled the trees. A shadow passed behind one of my upstairs windows. But I was outside, and I was alone, right? I turned slowly, staring at the house. The smell, the noises, the feeling of being watched. I knew without a doubt I wasn't alone in there, and whatever was inside those walls, it wanted out. I didn't go back into the basement. I couldn't. Not after what I'd seen. Not after hearing that whisper right behind me in the dark. I sat in the living room, gripping my coffee like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. Mrs. Hawthorne's words kept circling in my head. Asterisk, they said something was living in the walls. Asterisk. I told myself I misheard the whisper. That the carving on the basement wall was some cruel joke left behind by a previous tenant. That the noises in the walls were just pests. But as the day stretched on, the house felt heavier, like it was watching me. I tried to keep myself busy. I ran errands, stayed out as long as I could. But eventually, I had to come back. And as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. A shift. The air was thick, pressing down on me like a weight on my chest. Then came the smell. Rotten. Damp. Like something deep underground, festering. I gagged, covering my nose. It wasn't coming from the kitchen or the bathroom. It was seeping from the walls. I checked every vent, every corner. Nothing. But the smell grew stronger. And then the scratching started again. Faint, slow dragging. It came from inside the walls, right next to me. I pressed my ear against the wallpaper. Something moved on the other side. Not skittering like rats. Not the random settling of an old house. Something large. Something breathing. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something I could explain away. I grabbed my keys and rushed outside, gasping in the cool evening air. Mrs. Hawthorne was on her porch, watching me. "You look pale, dear," she said, her voice careful. I walked over, still shaken. "I think something is in the walls," I admitted. "Something big." She was silent for a moment, then sighed. "I hoped it wouldn't start this soon." I blinked. "What do you mean?" She looked past me toward my house, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Years ago," she said, "before the house was a rental, a man named Edgar Whitmore lived there. He was a scholar, obsessed with the occult. People said he was trying to open a door to something he shouldn't have." A shiver ran down my spine. "They found him in the basement one morning," she continued, "dead. But the strange thing was..." She hesitated. I swallowed. "What?" She lowered her voice. "His nails were torn to the bone, like he had been clawing at the walls." My stomach dropped. I thought of the basement, the bricks, the words. Asterisk, "Let me out." Asterisk. I felt sick. "You think he trapped something inside?" Mrs. Hawthorne looked at me, her expression unreadable. "Or maybe he was trying to keep something from getting out." A gust of wind rattled the trees. A shadow passed behind one of my upstairs windows. But I was outside, and I was alone, right? I turned slowly, staring at the house. The smell, the noises, the feeling of being watched. I knew without a doubt I wasn't alone in there, and whatever was inside those walls, I wanted out. I didn't go back inside right away. I stood in Mrs. Hawthorne's yard, staring at my house as the last bit of daylight faded. The windows reflected nothing but blackness, like deep, open mouths waiting to swallow me whole. The idea of spending another night in there made my skin crawl. Maybe I should leave, I muttered. Mrs. Hawthorne sighed. That might be wise. I turned to her, searching her face. But you don't think it'll let me, do you? She didn't answer. That silence said more than words ever could. Eventually, I forced myself to go back inside. I kept every light on, every door open, but it didn't matter. The moment I stepped in, the atmosphere was different. The air was thick with that rotten, damp stench. The walls felt closer, like they had shifted in my absence. And then I saw it. Crack. A long, jagged split running down the hallway wall, just beside the basement door. I was sure it hadn't been there before. A soft noise made me freeze. A faint exhale. From inside the crack. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. It sounded like breath, slow and steady, like someone pressing their lips to the gap and breathing into the house itself. Then something moved behind the wall. A slow, deliberate shift, as if something was pressing against the inside, testing the weakness. I turned and ran upstairs, locking myself in my bedroom. But the house wouldn't let me rest. At exactly 3:12 a.m., I woke to a familiar sound. The footsteps. But this time they weren't just in the hallway. They were everywhere. Above me, below me, inside the walls. A slow, deliberate pacing, like something was feeling out the edges of its prison. Then, a tap. A single, rhythmic knock against the wall right next to my bed. I turned my head, my breath catching in my throat. The wallpaper was bubbling, stretching, as if something beneath it was pressing outward. I shot out of bed, backing away. The tap came again, stronger this time. And then, the wallpaper split open. Just a sliver. Just enough for me to see. An eye. Milky white, unfocused. Pressed against the gap, staring at me from inside the wall. I screamed. The wall shuddered, the crack spread with a sickening, splintering sound, jagged lines crawling across the surface like veins. Something inside the wall sighed. Not a human sound. Something deeper. Hungrier. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the house. I didn't stop running until I was pounding on Mrs. Hawthorne's door. She opened it, took one look at my face and sighed. It's waking up, isn't it? She murmured. I could barely breathe. What the hell is inside my walls? She hesitated, then whispered. Something that should have stayed buried. I sat at Mrs. Hawthorne's kitchen table, gripping a cup of tea I had no intention of drinking. My hands were still shaking. She sat across from me, her expression calm but tired, like she'd been waiting for this moment. I licked my dry lips. Tell me everything. She sighed, staring into her cup. I only know pieces, she admitted. But the house has always been wrong. Even before Edgar Whitmore lived there. How long has it been like this? I asked. She hesitated. Since it was built, a chill ran through me. She set her cup down. It started with the original owner, Richard Bellamy. He built that house himself back in the late 1800s. Wasn't married. No family. Just a quiet man who kept to himself. She glanced at me. But people whispered. Said he was up to strange things. He rarely left the house, and when he did, he looked sick. Thin. Like something was draining him. A lump formed in my throat. Then one day he disappeared. Just gone. No body. No sign of where he went. She tapped her fingers on the table. They searched the house. The basement. The walls. But they never found him. I swallowed hard. The walls? Her eyes met mine. The house was different after that. People who moved and didn't stay long. They heard things. Saw things. A memory flashed in my mind. Asterisk that I asterisk, staring at me through the cracked wallpaper. I gripped the edge of the table. And Edgar Whitmore? The occultist? She nodded. He moved in during the 1950s. Became obsessed with the house's history. He was convinced Bellamy had done something, some kind of ritual to bind himself to the house. Or something worse. A cold weight settled in my chest. And that's when things got worse? Mrs. Hawthorne exhaled. People say Whitmore tried to fix it. That he found something in the basement, something Bellamy left behind. He tried to seal it away. I thought of the bricks in the basement. The words scratched into the wall. Asterisk, let me out. Asterisk. A horrible thought crept into my mind. What if Whitmore wasn't trying to keep something out? I whispered. She didn't answer, because we both already knew. He had been trying to trap it inside, and now the cracks were spreading. I pushed away from the table, my chair scraping against the floor. I can't go back in there, Mrs. Hawthorne sighed. If it's waking up, leaving might not be that simple. I ran a hand through my hair, pacing. So what do I do? Just sit in there and wait for it to... I stopped, because I could hear it. A sound so soft it barely registered. Scratching. Coming from inside Mrs. Hawthorne's walls. My blood ran cold. She heard it too. She paled, standing slowly. No. It wasn't just in my house anymore. It was spreading. The scratching inside Mrs. Hawthorne's walls grew louder. Slow and deliberate, like something testing the boundaries of its prison. She stared at the wall, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. This has never happened before, she whispered. I stepped back, my pulse pounding. What does that mean? She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed my wrist and pulled me toward the door. We need to go. We hurried outside into the cold night air. I turned to look at my house. The windows loomed like dark, empty sockets. The air around it felt wrong, heavy, charged like a thunderstorm about to break. Then I saw it. A new crack. It ran along the front of the house, cutting through the foundation like an open wound. And from inside, a voice, muffled, twisted. Asterisk, let me out. Asterisk. I staggered back, my breath hitching. Did you hear that? Mrs. Hawthorne just nodded, her face grim. The house wasn't holding it anymore. I don't remember making the decision to move, but suddenly we were in her car, speeding away from the house, the road blurring beneath us. Only when we reached the outskirts of town did she finally speak. We need to find Whitmore's journals. I swallowed, gripping my knees. What? She turned onto a narrow, tree-lined road. Before he died, Edgar Whitmore kept records. Diaries. He knew what was in that house. If there's a way to stop this, it'll be in his writings. I stared at her. And where exactly do we find those? She gave me a sideways glance. At his grave. ###. 15 minutes later, we stood in front of an old, crumbling headstone in the town cemetery. Asterisk Edgar Whitmore. 1903-1962 asterisk. The air was unnervingly still. The distant hum of traffic felt too far away, like we had stepped outside of reality. Mrs. Hawthorne knelt beside the grave and started digging through the overgrown grass. After a moment, she pulled out a rusted metal box. She pried it open with shaking hands. Inside, wrapped in brittle, yellowed cloth, was a small leather-bound journal. She exhaled. It's still here. I leaned in as she flipped through the pages. Most of it was faded, scrawled in frantic, cramped handwriting. Then she stopped. A single passage was underlined in red ink. Asterisk, it is not just inside the house. Asterisk, it is inside the walls, inside the air, inside me. Asterisk, the cracks are how it spreads. Asterisk, once it gets out, it does not stop. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves around us. I looked at Mrs. Hawthorne, my throat dry. We're already too late, aren't we? She didn't answer, because we both heard it. A long, slow scraping sound. Not from the grave, from the trees, from the ground beneath our feet. The cracks weren't just in the house anymore. They were everywhere. The scraping sound rippled through the earth beneath us, like something shifting, stretching, waking up, I took a step back from Whitmore's grave, my breath sharp and uneven. Mrs. Hawthorne clutched the journal to her chest, her knuckles white. The wind had stopped. The night was too quiet. Even the distant hum of traffic was gone, like the world had been sealed off, like we were inside something. Then, crack. Not from the house, not from the ground, from the sky. I looked up and my stomach dropped. A jagged, black fissure was splitting through the night itself, stretching across the sky like a fracture in glass. The stars beyond it flickered, shifted. Something was moving behind the crack, watching. Mrs. Hawthorne grabbed my arm, her voice a tight whisper. We need to go. Now. I didn't argue. We ran. We barely made it back to her car before the first noise hit. A deep, wet sound like something enormous peeling itself free from a cocoon. The graveyard behind us trembled. We didn't look back. ###. We sped through the empty streets, past dark houses with their sleeping occupants, oblivious to the thing unraveling beneath their feet. I could still hear it. The scratching. The dragging. It wasn't coming from the house anymore. It was inside the town. Mrs. Hawthorne gripped the wheel, her knuckles bloodless. It's never spread this far before, she muttered. I turned to her, my voice hoarse. What the hell are we supposed to do? She didn't answer right away. Then she flipped open the journal again, scanning the pages. Finally she exhaled. Whitmore wrote about a ritual. One last attempt to seal it. But he failed? I swallowed hard. Why? She glanced at me. Because it wasn't just inside the house anymore. My chest tightened. If it was never meant to be contained in one place, then there was no stopping it now. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the reflection in the car's side mirror. And that's when I saw it. A figure. Standing in the middle of the road behind us. Not moving. Not chasing. Just watching. It had no face. Just a hollow, gaping crack where its features should have been. And it was smiling. I couldn't look away. The figure stood in the middle of the road, distant but too clear, like the night itself had folded around it. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but I knew it was watching me. A crack ran down the center of its face from forehead to chin, splitting its features into nothing. The edges of the crack pulsed, widening and narrowing, like a mouth struggling to speak. I gripped Mrs. Hawthorne's arm. "Do you see that?" She didn't turn. She didn't have to. Her foot slammed on the gas. The car lurched forward, the tires shrieking against the pavement. I braced myself, my heart hammering. I didn't dare look in the mirror again, but I felt it. Something shifting. Something following. Mrs. Hawthorne's voice was tight. "We have to end this before it completely gets out." I swallowed. "How?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she gripped the journal like a lifeline. "Whitmore wrote about the cracks," she muttered. "About how they're not just damage, they're openings. Weak points. If we can close them." Her words cut off as the car jerked violently to the side. A blow. Something slamming into us. We skidded. Spun. The headlights streaked across the dark road. My seatbelt cut into my chest. The world flipped. And then we stopped. Silence. The car had come to rest in a ditch at the side of the road. Everything was sideways. Glass cracked. Engine sputtering. My head throbbed. And then I heard it. The footsteps. Slow. Measured. Getting closer. A shadow passed in front of the headlights. Mrs. Hawthorne groaned, shifting beside me. I turned my head. Pain screamed through my skull. Outside, the hollow man stood at the edge of the light. Not moving. Not needing to move. Because something else was moving for it. The ground behind it, asterisk beneath it asterisk, was splitting open. More cracks spreading outward like veins. Something inside them was writhing. Clawing. Trying to pull itself free. I reached for the door handle. My hands were shaking too hard to grip it. "We need to get out of here." Mrs. Hawthorne gritted her teeth. "It's too late to run." She shoved the journal into my hands. "Find the last entry. Find what Whitmore was trying to do." I fumbled through the pages. The words swam in my vision. Then, a passage written in frantic, almost illegible script. Asterisk, "The only way to seal the cracks is to offer something in return." Asterisk, asterisk, "Something of equal weight. A life for a door." Asterisk, asterisk, "The house took Bellamy. The house took me." Asterisk, asterisk, "It will take more." Asterisk. I stared at the words, my blood running cold. A sacrifice. I looked at Mrs. Hawthorne, and she was already looking at me. A quiet understanding passed between us. Something had to be given to close the cracks. But who? The hollow man took a step closer. The cracks beneath its feet pulsed, widening, the darkness inside them alive. Mrs. Hawthorne gripped my arm. "We don't have much time." I barely heard her. My mind was stuck on the words in Whitmore's journal. Asterisk, "A life for a door." Asterisk. It didn't make sense. Whitmore had tried to seal the cracks, but he had failed. What? I turned to Mrs. Hawthorne. How did Whitmore die? Her face was tight, her eyes flicking to the hollow man's shadow stretching toward us. "No one knows," she said quickly. "People just found his body inside the house." Asterisk. I grabbed her wrist. "Where?" She hesitated, and that was my answer. "In the walls, wasn't he?" I whispered. She looked away. It clicked all at once. Whitmore hadn't been able to stop it because he had offered himself, but not in the right way. It hadn't taken him. It had kept him, bound inside the house. I shook my head, my pulse hammering. A sacrifice isn't enough. It has to be chosen by the house. It takes what it wants, and if it doesn't accept the offering, I swallowed hard. Then the cracks just keep spreading. Mrs. Hawthorne's breath caught. She understood now too. We had no control. We weren't the ones who got to decide. The house did. And right now it was choosing. The ground beneath us groaned. I turned my head. The hollow man was right outside the car now. It leaned forward, the crack in its face widening, stretching open, and for the first time I heard its voice. It came from inside my head, whispered in 1,000 overlapping tones. Asterisk, it's your turn. Asterisk. The shadows beneath it rushed forward. Mrs. Hawthorne grabbed me, shoved me out of the car. I hit the cold pavement, gasping. I turned back just in time to see the darkness swallow her. She didn't scream. She just vanished. The hollow man stepped backward into the widening crack. Its body folded, peeled away, disappearing into the void. And then, the ground sealed itself. The fractures in the sky vanished. The air grew still. The world was quiet again. I sat there, shaking, staring at the empty space where Mrs. Hawthorne had been. She was gone. The cracks were gone. The hollow man was gone. And somehow I was still here. The house had chosen. I sat frozen on the couch, my pulse a dull roar in my ears. The scratching inside the walls was slow, deliberate, and then, asterisk, let me out. Asterisk, Mrs. Hawthorne's voice. I squeezed my eyes shut. No, this wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. The cracks were sealed. The hollow man was gone. But she was still here. I forced myself to stand. My legs were unsteady, my body screaming at me to run, to leave this house forever. But I didn't. Instead, I moved toward the wall. The sound was coming from behind the old bookshelf. My hands trembled as I grabbed the edges, yanking it away from the wall. Dust billowed into the air, thick and choking. And then I saw it. The wallpaper was torn in places, revealing the same scratched words I had seen in the basement. Asterisk, let me out. Asterisk, dozens of them, layered on top of each other. Desperate, I swallowed hard. And then, a crack formed, thin and jagged, running down the center of the wall. And beneath it, something moved. A shadow shifted, stretching, pressing against the wall from the other side. And I knew what was happening. The house had taken Mrs. Hawthorne, just like it had taken Bellamy, just like it had tried to take Whitmore. But she wasn't gone. She was inside, trapped. And now it wanted to trade, a life for a door. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to seal it up, to leave her there. But I couldn't. I owed her. She had saved me. I pressed my palm against the crack. The wall was ice cold. Mrs. Hawthorne? My voice was barely a whisper. Silence. Then, asterisk, it's not done with you yet. Asterisk, the voice wasn't hers anymore. It was something else. Something old. Something hungry. The crack widened beneath my hand. Darkness leaked through, curling around my fingers like smoke. And then, a hand shot out. Pale, twisted, not human anymore. I screamed, yanking back just as the hand clawed at the air, reaching, grasping. The walls trembled. The house breathed. And I knew. I couldn't stop it. I turned and ran. Out the door. Down the steps. I didn't stop until I reached the car. I threw myself inside, turned the key. The engine groaned, then roared to life. And in the rearview mirror, I saw the house, standing silent, watching. The crack in the wall still open. Something standing just behind it, waiting. I slammed my foot on the gas. I didn't stop driving until the house was miles behind me, until the town was behind me, until there was nothing but the open road ahead. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. I never went back. I wanted to. I thought about burning it down, about going back for Mrs. Hawthorne, about finding some way to fix what had been opened. But deep down, I knew. The house didn't want to be destroyed. It wanted to spread. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what it was doing. I still hear the scratching sometimes. In walls that shouldn't have anything inside them. In places I've never been before. The cracks are gone. But something else is out there now. And one day when the house finds the right person, it'll open the door again.